The gravy boat was still warm in my hands, porcelain smooth against my palms, the weight of it familiar from a dozen Thanksgivings past. Steam curled off the surface in soft, fragrant spirals, carrying the scent of thyme, butter, and the kind of slow-simmered care that only Grandma knew how to coax from a cast-iron pot. I'd just come back from the kitchen, where I'd reheated it after my stepfather, accidentally, let it go cold during his third toast about loyalty and second chances. I'd smiled then, like I always did, nodded, swallowed the lump in my throat like it was just another bite of dry turkey. But this time, when I set the dish on the table, he snatched it away mid-pour, not with a playful grab, not with the teasing roughness uncles sometimes use, but with a sharp, deliberate yank that sent a splash of hot gravy across the linen. Everyone flinched. My mother didn't. She kept her eyes on her plate, fork hovering, already bracing for what came next. "You ruin one more holiday," he hissed, low enough that only I could hear, though his eyes swept the table like it was performance art, "and I'll make sure you disappear." Then he laughed, just a short, practiced chuckle, and slid the gravy boat back toward me like it was nothing. "Careful, sweetheart, hot." And just like that, the tension dissolved into murmurs of, "Oh, you too?" And always so dramatic. My cousin snorted into his wine. My uncle clapped my stepfather on the back like it was brotherly ribbing. Even the candlelight seemed to soften, as if the room itself had decided to forgive him before I'd even processed the threat. But then silence. Not the kind that follows laughter, not the polite pause before someone passes the stuffing. This was a different silence, heavy, final. I turned. Grandma had set her fork down, not with a clatter but with deliberate care, as if laying a gavel on a judge's bench. Her hands, veined, arthritic but steady, rested flat on the tablecloth. Her eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter glass, locked onto my stepfather. Not angry, not tearful, just done. "No," she said, voice quiet but carrying like church bells in snow. "Not this time." The room froze. My mother finally looked up, her face a mask of panic and denial. "Mom, please." But Grandma didn't blink. She didn't apologize. She just kept staring at him, and in that look was everything she'd swallowed for decades. The hushed arguments behind closed doors, the missed birthdays, the way he'd edged her out of family decisions after my grandfather died. And now, watching him threaten her granddaughter over gravy, something so mundane, so ordinary, it was as if the last thread of her patience had finally snapped. I stood there, still holding the stupid porcelain boat, heat radiating through my fingers, my pulse hammering in my ears. Outside, wind rattled the bare branches against the window. Inside, the scent of sage and sweet potatoes mingled with something sharper. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something like hope. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in seeing him for what he was. And Grandma, she wasn't just watching anymore. She was standing. That night, after the last dish had been scraped and the guests had muttered their awkward goodbyes, after my mother had kissed my forehead with trembling lips and whispered, "Don't make things worse, baby," I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my holiday sweater, the cuffs damp from dishwater and something else I wouldn't name. My forearm throbbed where his fingers had dug in, not hard enough to leave a perfect bruise, but enough to imprint pressure like a brand. 5 faint crescents blooming beneath the skin like morbid constellations. I turned my arm under the lamplight, watching the shadows shift. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time it happened in front of witnesses, and the first time someone had said no. I opened my laptop, not to cry, not to rage post, but to test the waters. Carefully, I cropped a photo, just the bruising, no face, no room, no identifying details, blurred the edges until it looked like a watercolor of pain. Beneath it, I typed only, "When family first means your pain comes last, have you been there?" I hesitated, my thumb hovered over post. Part of me expected silence, or worse, suggestions to pray about it or just move out. But within minutes, the replies began trickling in. Not hundreds, just a few at first, but each one felt like a lifeline thrown across the dark. I stayed quiet for 12 years, left on my 30th birthday. You're not alone. My aunt said the same thing after my uncle cornered me at Christmas. Think of the family photo. Family first is their slogan, not yours. Your safety comes first. Always. One comment simply read, "I see you." Tears welled, but I didn't let them fall. Not yet, because something had shifted. I wasn't just carrying this in the dark anymore. There were others who knew the weight of that phrase, family first, used like a silencer on truth, a gag on grief. And yet, empathy wasn't protection. Kind words wouldn't stop him from coming back next year or the next time he needed to talk in the garage when Mom wasn't looking. I needed more than solidarity. I needed proof. I opened a new folder on my desktop, named it quietly, Thanksgiving 2025. Then I dug through my phone, found the time-stamped photo of the table before dinner, my stepfather's jacket clearly visible, his posture already coiled. I saved the audio note I'd accidentally recorded when I'd left my voice memo app running during dessert, background chatter, his laugh too loud, then that low, venomous whisper. "You ruin one more holiday." But the real anchor, the quiet storm, was Grandma. Earlier that evening, after everyone had gone, she'd pressed a folded tissue into my hand. Not for tears. Inside was a small, silver key. "The lockbox in my closet," she'd murmured, her voice barely above breath. "Page 42, you'll know what to do." I hadn't opened it yet, but I knew that whatever was inside wasn't just memory, it was evidence. And for the first time, I wasn't just the daughter who overreacted. I was the witness who remembered, the granddaughter who listened, the one who finally had receipts, not just for the world, but for herself. Grandma's dining room had always felt like a cathedral built for secrets. The walls were lined with walnut panels that absorbed sound, the kind of wood that seemed to sigh when the house settled at night. Above the sideboard hung her heirloom silver, tarnished but polished religiously every November, arranged like armor on a ghost. And the lace table runner, hand-stitched by her mother in 1937, passed down with the unspoken rule, never spill, never stain, never speak out of turn. Every Thanksgiving, we gathered beneath the soft glow of the brass chandelier, its crystals catching the light like frozen tears, and performed the same ritual. Gratitude on the surface, tension beneath. I used to love setting that table as a child, carefully placing each fork, aligning the water goblets just so, fluffing the napkins into little swans. Back then, I believed the warmth was real, that the laughter meant safety, that the way my stepfather patted my head after I poured his wine meant I'd earned his approval. But over the years, the gestures grew thinner, the smiles tighter. I learned to read the room like a barometer. The way Mom's shoulders tensed when he cleared his throat, the way my uncle suddenly found his phone fascinating whenever things got too emotional. The clink of cutlery stopped being background noise and started sounding like countdown ticks. Clink, 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 each one a warning that the mood could turn with a single misplaced word. This year, I'd worn my softest sweater, the oatmeal-colored one with the tiny embroidered leaves at the cuffs, the one he once said made me look humble. I'd kept my voice low, my opinions lighter than air. When he made his toast about second chances and forgiving the ungrateful, I'd nodded. When he jokingly asked if I'd remembered to iron his dress shirt, though I hadn't touched his laundry in years, I'd smiled and said, "Of course." I played my part. And still, it wasn't enough. Now, days later, I stood alone in that same room, moonlight spilling through the bay windows like liquid silver. The table was cleared, the chairs pushed in, the lace runner folded away. But the air still hummed with what had happened. I ran my fingers along the edge of the sideboard where the gravy boat had sat, where his hand had closed around mine like a vice. The porcelain had been washed, dried, returned to its doily-lined cabinet as if nothing had occurred. But I remembered the heat of it, the weight. The way it felt like the only thing anchoring me to the earth before everything tilted. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches of the old maple, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. I thought of all the holidays spent pretending, all the bruises hidden beneath turtlenecks, all the times I'd whispered, "I'm fine," while my stomach twisted into knots. The surface had always been gleaming, polished silver, steaming dishes, coordinated centerpieces. But the substance was exhaustion, fear, the slow erosion of self under the weight of keeping the peace. And yet, even in this hollowed-out quiet, something had changed. Grandma had stood, not just physically, but morally, ethically. She'd broken the spell. And as I stood there in the moonlit dining room, I realized I no longer needed the performance. The table could stay empty. the silver could tarnish. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to earn a place at it. I was learning how to build my own. He didn't start with fists. That's what people never understand. Abuse rarely announces itself with a scream or a slap on day one. It begins with a raised eyebrow when you laugh too loud, a sigh when you ask a question, a joke that lands just short of cruelty, but close enough to make you flinch inwardly, then laugh it off to prove you're not too sensitive. By the time my father died, suddenly from a heart attack at 42, my mother was already drowning in grief, and my stepfather, Mark, slid into the void like water finding its level. He was steady. He paid the bills. He fixed the fence. He held her while she cried, and in return he asked for one thing: loyalty, absolute, unquestioning, silent loyalty. At first it felt like safety. I was 13, reeling, and he gave us structure, a roof, routines, rules, but the rules were never for him, they were for me. Don't interrupt when Mark speaks. Don't wear that skirt, it's distracting. Don't mention your dad's things unless he brings him up first. And every time I slipped, a wrong tone, a delayed "yes, sir," a tear he deemed dramatic, the correction came. Sometimes it was a cold shoulder for days. Sometimes a sharp pinch under the dinner table, masked by a jovial toast. Always, always followed by, "You made me do that." My mother saw, I know she did, but grief had hollowed her out and Mark had become her oxygen, so she learned to look away, to smooth things over, to say, "He's under a lot of stress," or "You know how he is," or most often, "Family first." That phrase became her shield, her mantra, her excuse to stay quiet while I disappeared piece by piece behind a smile I wore like a mask. Over the years, he perfected the art of isolation. He'd mock my friends as dramatic or unstable until I stopped inviting them over. He'd question my grades, my choices, my worth, always framed as tough love, always delivered in private, so no one could witness the erosion. And when I graduated high school and moved 2 states away for college, he called it abandonment. He told Mom I didn't care about her, that I'd chosen my life over my family. And she, wounded, lonely, dependent, believed him. But this Thanksgiving was different. I'd come back willingly. I'd brought his favorite pie. I'd even offered to help him with the garage cleanup, an olive branch I now realized he'd twisted into a noose. Because the moment I set the gravy boat down, something in his eyes shifted. Not anger, possession. Like I'd overstepped by existing too brightly in his house, on his holiday, under his roof. Never mind that the mortgage was still in my father's name, that the deed technically belonged to Mom, that every photo on the wall showed a family he'd married into, not built. When he grabbed my wrist, it wasn't rage. It was rehearsal. A reminder, you are still mine to control. And when Mom looked down at her plate instead of at me, her silence wasn't neutrality, it was permission. But then, Grandma stood. And in that single act, the whole fragile architecture of family first cracked open, revealing what had been festering underneath all along. Not love, but leverage. Not unity, but control. And for the first time, I saw it clearly, not as a child begging for approval, but as a woman who finally understood. Some families don't protect you. They consume you. And sometimes, the only way out is to stop pretending the feast isn't poisoned. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke to the scent of chamomile and cold linoleum, the unmistakable aroma of Grandma's spare bedroom, where I'd slept curled on the twin bed like a child again, though my body ached with the weight of adulthood. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains she'd sewn in the 70s, casting delicate shadows across the quilt her mother had stitched during the Depression. I hadn't planned to stay, but after the sheriff left and Mom whispered, "Just go, please, just go," I, driven the 3 miles to Grandma's bungalow with tears blurring the road and my arm throbbing like a second heartbeat. She was already in the kitchen when I shuffled in, wrapped in her old flannel robe, hair still damp from the shower. Without a word, she handed me a mug of tea strong with honey and pressed a bag of frozen peas wrapped in a dish towel to my forearm. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the way they'd been since her stroke 5 years back, but her eyes were sharp as flint. "I believed him once too," she said, her voice low and steady, like river stones worn smooth by time but still unyielding. She sat across from me at the Formica table, the one with the cigarette burned near the edge from when Grandpa used to tap his ashes there in '68. "Thought he was good for your mother after your dad passed. Thought I was being practical." She shook her head, a flicker of shame crossing her face. But practicality doesn't feed the soul, honey. And it sure don't protect the ones you love. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan, the same deep blue one she always wore in winter, and pulled out a spiral-bound notebook, its cover faded to a soft sage green, corners bent from years of handling. She slid it across the table. I started writing after the first time he corrected you at Easter dinner. You were 15, said you rolled your eyes when he made a joke about your weight. Her lips tightened. I saw what he did, the way he cornered you by the punch bowl. The way you didn't eat dessert after that. My breath caught. I hadn't remembered that, or maybe I'd buried it. She opened the notebook, page after page filled with her looping cursive dates, times, quotes. April 12, 2019. You'd be prettier if you smiled more. Spoken loudly at cousin's wedding. She cried in the restroom. July 3, 2021, blocked her from leaving garage, said, you'll thank me later for keeping you humble. November 24, 2022, told her college boyfriend wasn't good enough and threw his gift in trash while she watched. Each entry was clinical, almost detached, but the care in the details betrayed her fury. She'd been watching, not just passively but actively, documenting, witnessing. And then on page 42, just as she'd hinted, the entry from last summer. Overheard him tell Linda Mom that if granddaughter ever makes a scene, he'll handle it quietly. Said the neighbors already think she's unstable. I traced the words with my finger, my vision blurring. All those years I thought I was alone, she'd been keeping vigil. Not with grand gestures, but with ink and observation. The quiet resistance of an elder who knew truth needed a paper trail to survive. She reached across and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was papery, cool, but her grip was firm. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, she said. And you don't have to prove it to them. You just have to prove it to the law. In that moment, I didn't feel like the fragile daughter or the inconvenient granddaughter. I felt seen, validated, anchored by a love that hadn't failed me, only waited for the right time to rise. And when she whispered, I've got your back no matter what, I finally let myself cry, not from pain, but from the relief of being believed. I spent the next 2 days holed up in Grandma's sunroom, the one with the bay window that overlooked her overgrown rose garden. The same roses she'd stopped tending after Grandpa died, saying they reminded her too much of hands in the dirt and shared silence. Now, curled on the wicker chaise with her sage-green notebook open on my lap, I felt like I was piecing together a map of my own survival. Every entry was a breadcrumb leading back to moments I'd convinced myself were misunderstandings, exaggerations, or just how he is. But seeing them laid out in Grandma's careful script, dated, contextualized, witnessed, it wasn't memory anymore. It was evidence. Tucked in the back pocket of the notebook was a single sheet of legal paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, folded with the precision of someone who'd handled it often. I unfolded it slowly, my pulse quickening as I read the notary seal at the bottom. State of redacted, county of redacted. Sworn and subscribed before me this 14th day of June, 2023. Below it, in neat block letters, was a statement from Mrs. Alina Ruiz, our next-door neighbor from 2021 to 2023, now living in Arizona. She described, in calm, unembellished detail, how she'd heard shouting through the privet hedge one August evening, Mark's voice, sharp and commanding. You think you can walk away from me? You belong here and you'll learn your place. Then the sound of something heavy hitting the porch steps. When she peeked through her kitchen window, she saw me limping back inside, clutching my arm, while Mark stood on the porch lighting a cigarette, his posture relaxed, almost smug. She'd written. She told me later it was a fall down the stairs, but there are no stairs on that porch. That single paragraph undid years of gaslighting in 3 sentences. My hands trembled as I scanned the document with Grandma's old flatbed scanner, the whirring sound loud in the quiet house. I saved it as Ruiz notarized 2023, PDF, timestamped it with my phone's geotagged photo of the original, and encrypted the file. Then I drafted an email to the legal advocate I'd connected with through the domestic violence resource line, someone Grandma had quietly vetted through her church's elder outreach program. I attached the statement, a redacted version of Grandma's notes, and a photo of my forearm from Thanksgiving night. I didn't beg. I didn't dramatize. I simply wrote, I'm seeking guidance on next steps for civil protection and potential fraud investigation. I have additional documentation available upon secure request. Within hours, she replied, This is strong corroborative evidence. Do not confront him. Do not delete anything. And if you feel unsafe, call 911 even if nothing happens. A police report creates a paper trail. Buoyed by that validation, I printed a clean copy of Mrs. Ruiz's statement, placed it in a manila envelope with a short, polite note. Given recent events, I believe this may be relevant to our family's understanding of past incidents. I'm available to discuss calmly and privately. And slipped it under Mom's front door that evening. I didn't knock, didn't wait, just left it there like a stone dropped into still water. The next morning, my phone buzzed before sunrise. It was Mom, voice tight, voice frayed. How could you do this? She whispered. After everything he's done for us, you're tearing this family apart over old rumors. She accused me of ruining Thanksgiving forever, of weaponizing a neighbor's hearsay, of choosing strangers over blood. I wanted to scream, to list every bruise, every lie, every time I'd swallowed my truth to keep her from breaking. But I didn't. I just said, I'm not tearing anything apart, Mom. I'm asking you to finally see what's already broken. She hung up. And as I stood in Grandma's kitchen, staring out at the dormant rose bushes, the silence felt heavier than before, until the doorbell rang. I froze. My first thought was him. My second was a social worker. My third was the sheriff. When I peered through the peephole, it was the last one. Deputy Chen stood on the porch, hat in hand, expression unreadable. Ma'am, he said gently, we received a wellness check request this morning. An elderly resident expressed concern about potential domestic distress at your mother's address on Thanksgiving. We're following up as a precaution. Do you feel safe right now? Behind me, Grandma appeared in the hallway, arms crossed, nodding slowly. I took a breath. Then I opened the door and stepped into the light. The deputy's cruiser sat in Grandma's driveway like a silent sentinel, its radio emitting soft static that cut through the brittle morning air. He didn't loom or rush, just stood with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, posture neutral but eyes alert, taking in everything. The way my knuckles whitened around the doorframe, the fresh bandage peeking from under my sweater cuff, the tension in my shoulders that hadn't eased since Thanksgiving. I'm safe now, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But I wasn't 2 days ago. Deputy Chen nodded once, then asked if I'd be willing to speak with him on the porch. Not inside, too confined, too vulnerable, but out here in the open, where Grandma could watch from the bay window like a silent guardian. I wrapped myself in her wool shawl and stepped onto the creaking wooden planks, the November chill biting through the fabric. He kept a respectful distance, but his gaze didn't waver. Can you tell me, in your own words, what happened on Thursday? And so I did, not with sobs or theatrics, but with the quiet precision of someone who'd rehearsed this truth in her head 100 times. I described the dinner, the toast, the gravy boat, the grip on my wrist, the whispered threat. I told him about the history, the corrections, the isolation, the escalating control. I didn't call it abuse outright. I let the facts hang in the air like smoke, waiting for him to see the fire beneath. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked, Do you have any documentation of prior incidents? I hesitated, then went back inside and returned with a flash drive. Not the whole archive, not yet, but enough. A PDF of Mrs. Ruiz's notarized statement, 3 dated entries from Grandma's notebook, redacted to protect her, and the time-stamped photo of my arm. He accepted it without comment, slid it into an evidence sleeve from his belt, and wrote the intake number in his logbook. This'll be filed as a domestic incident report, he explained. It won't trigger an arrest by itself, but it creates a record. If anything else happens, even a raised voice, a text that feels threatening, call us immediately. Patterns matter more than single events in court. I nodded, throat tight. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a foothold. Just then, a car rolled slowly past the house, familiar, too familiar, marked silver SUV. He didn't stop, but I saw his profile through the driver's window, jaw set, eyes fixed straight ahead. He'd been watching. Maybe he'd followed me from Mom's. Maybe he'd seen the cruiser and circled back. The flash of panic was instant, visceral, but I didn't flinch. I stood taller. Let him see me talking to the deputy. Let him know the silence was over. Deputy Chen noticed it too. His hand drifted subtly toward his radio. "You've got a safe place to stay?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said, glancing back at Grandma's window, where her silhouette hadn't like a promise. "I'm staying here." He gave me his direct line, told me to save it under a fake name, and reminded me that restraining orders could be filed same day if I felt at immediate risk. Then he left, the cruiser pulling away with quiet authority, leaving me alone on the porch with the wind and the weight of what I'd just done. Two pressures now squeezed my chest like a vice. The old fear, his retaliation, Mom's rejection, the family's collapse, and the new urgency. I needed more than incident reports. I needed proof he'd been stealing, manipulating, rewriting our lives behind closed doors. Because if he'd lied about my disrespect, what else had he falsified? That afternoon, while Grandma napped, I dug deeper into old bank statements Mom had once shown me in passing, back when she still trusted me with family matters. Buried in the 2022 files was a transfer I didn't recognize. $8,500 from her emergency fund to a company called Haven Ridge Holdings. I'd never heard of it. But when I searched the business registry that night, the listed manager was Mark Reynolds. My breath stopped. It wasn't just control, it was theft. And if he'd taken money, what about the house? The next morning, I called my legal advocate again. "I need to pull property records," I said. "Today." And just like that, the fight shifted. From proving I was hurt to proving he'd been building an empire on our grief. The county record's office smelled of old paper, lemon-scented cleaner, and the quiet desperation of people trying to reclaim pieces of their lives. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I sat at a public terminal, fingers trembling slightly as I typed in the address of the house I'd grown up in. The one with the wraparound porch where I'd learned to ride a bike. The kitchen where my father used to sing off-key while flipping pancakes. The bedroom window I'd stared out of for years, wondering when someone would finally notice I was drowning. Now, I was here not as a daughter returning home, but as an investigator walking into a crime scene only she could see. Grandma sat beside me in her best winter coat, hands folded neatly in her lap like she was waiting for a doctor's appointment, but her eyes scanned the room like a general surveying a battlefield. She insisted on coming. "They respect elders," she'd said that morning, patting her bun. "And I intend to be respected." On screen, the property profile loaded slowly. Owner, Linda E. Carter and Mark A. Reynolds. My stomach dropped. Mom's name was there, but so was his. And the deed had been amended just 10 months after Dad's death, during the fog of Mom's deepest grief, when she could barely get out of bed. Let alone review legal documents. According to the filing, Mark had been added via a spousal transfer affidavit, citing joint marital contribution. But they hadn't been married for 2 years when Dad died. The house was bought in 2008, 10 years before Mark ever entered the picture. I printed the deed, my breath shallow. Then I cross-referenced it with the county's power of attorney registry. There it was, a notarized POA signed by Mom in March 2021, authorizing Mark to act on her behalf in all real property matters. But when I showed the copy to Mom later that week, carefully, gently, her face went pale. "I don't remember signing that," she whispered. "He brought me papers after my cataract surgery, said it was for the insurance claim. I was still groggy." That was all I needed. Back at the legal aid office, my advocate helped me draft a title dispute notice, a formal challenge to the validity of Mark's ownership claim based on potential fraud, undue influence, and lack of informed consent. We attached the deed, the POA, and Mom's sworn affidavit, notarized the next morning at the library, her hands shaking but her voice firm, stating she never knowingly transferred equity in the home. Then, with Grandma sitting beside me like a talisman, I filed it with the county clerk and requested an immediate lien-freeze pending investigation. But we weren't done. Armed with the bank transfer records showing the $8,500 and 3 more unexplained withdrawals totaling over $22,000, I walked into First Metropolitan Trust, the same bank where Dad had opened his first savings account at 16. The manager, a woman named Ms. Patel with kind eyes and a crisp navy suit, listened without judgment as I laid out the timeline. Grief, isolation, financial control. She didn't make excuses. She simply said, "Let me pull the full audit trail." 20 minutes later, she returned with a thick printout. Every transfer to Haven Ridge Holdings had been initiated by Mark using Mom's online credentials, but the IP address traced back to his office, not their home. Worse, the business had no legitimate operations, no employees, no tax filings, no physical address beyond a P.O. box. It was a shell, a vessel for siphoning. Ms. Patel's expression hardened. "We're flagging this account for suspected elder financial exploitation," she said quietly. "I'm freezing all outgoing transfers effective immediately, and I'll be submitting this to our internal fraud division and, if you wish, to Adult Protective Services." That afternoon, I returned to the courthouse with Grandma and filed for a temporary restraining order, not just for my safety, but to prevent Mark from selling, refinancing, or altering the property while the title dispute was active. The clerk stamped the paperwork with a firm thunk, the sound echoing like a gavel. As we stepped out into the gray November light, Grandma squeezed my arm. "You're not just fighting for yourself now," she said. "You're fighting for her too." I looked down at the stack of documents in my hands, deed, bank logs, affidavits, receipts, all bound with a red legal clip. This wasn't vengeance. It was restoration. And for the first time, the law wasn't just a distant fortress. It was a tool in my hands, sharpened by truth, witnessed by allies, and backed by receipts that couldn't be erased. I didn't call it an intervention. I didn't call it a confrontation. I called it a family meeting, neutral, civil, almost bureaucratic, because I knew if I used words like accountability or reckoning, they'd dismiss it as drama. But I also knew that hiding the truth behind closed doors had only ever served him. So I chose a room with no exits for his charm. The fellowship hall at St. Luke's, the same sunlit space with honey-colored pews and a piano in the corner where we'd held Grand's memorial service 4 years earlier. The air still carried the faint scent of lilies and old hymnals, a place built for reflection, not deflection. I sent the invitation by certified mail. "Please join me Saturday at 10 a.m. to discuss the events of November 27 and next steps for family integrity." No threats, no accusations, just a time, a place, and the unspoken promise that silence was no longer an option. They came, all of them, Mom tense and clutching her purse like a shield, my uncle already scowling as if bracing for an ambush, my cousin scrolling on his phone like this was a chore, and Mark's slicked hair, cashmere coat, a smirk playing at his lips as he strode in like he owned the room. "Took you long enough to stop playing victim," he said under his breath as he passed me, but I didn't rise. I just nodded toward the table at the front. 3 binders sat there, aligned with military precision. One red, one blue, one green, each labeled simply evidence, corroboration, title, and finance. I waited until everyone was seated. Then I spoke, not loudly, but with a calm so steady it seemed to still the dust motes in the air. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to present facts. You don't have to agree with them, but you will hear them." Mark scoffed. "Oh, here we go, the one-woman courtroom." But I didn't look at him. I opened the red binder and placed a color copy of Mrs. Ruiz's notarized statement on the table. "In 2023, our neighbor documented a physical altercation on the back porch, described as not a fall, but a shove." She filed this statement voluntarily. I turned to the blue binder. "My grandmother has kept a private log since 2019, noting patterns of control, intimidation, and public humiliation. These are not opinions. They are dated observations, witnessed in real time." Then the green binder. "And this is the property deed, amended in 2021, adding Mark's name without my mother's informed consent, coupled with bank records showing over $22,000 transferred to a shell company under his control while she was medically vulnerable." Mom's hands flew to her mouth. My uncle stopped breathing. But Mark just leaned back, arms crossed. "Circumstantial, emotional, and frankly pathetic. You're trying to destroy me over notes and old rumors." That's when I reached into my satchel, not for more paper, but for my phone. I tapped the screen. And from the small speaker, clear as ice cracking, came his voice, recorded on Thanksgiving night, captured by accident when Grandma's hearing aid companion app had been left running during dessert. "You ruin one more holiday, and I'll make sure you disappear." The room went dead silent. Even the radiator's hiss seemed to pause. My cousin dropped his phone. Mom stared at the floor, tears pooling. My uncle slowly turned to Mark, his face unreadable but his jaw clenched like a trap about to spring. Mark's smirk vanished. "That's taken out of context," he snapped, but his voice wavered. "No," I said softly. "It's in context, it's time-stamped, it's audible, and it's not the first time." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply closed the binders, stood, and said, "The legal filings are already in motion. The bank has frozen the accounts. The title dispute is pending. This isn't a negotiation, it's a notification." For the first time, he looked small, not defeated, but exposed. And in that moment, the family mask didn't just slip. It shattered, because they'd all heard it, not as a story, not as my version, but as his own voice, cold and clear, threatening to erase me from the world over a gravy boat. And as the silence stretched, thick with shame and dawning horror, I realized something profound. I hadn't needed them to believe me before. But now, they couldn't unhear it, and that changed everything. The silence after the recording ended wasn't empty. It was thick, charged like the air before a storm breaks. My cousin kept staring at his hands. My uncle wouldn't look at Mark. Mom sat frozen, her breath shallow, her knuckles white around the strap of her purse. And Mark, he shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out brittle, hollow, like glass about to splinter. I let the quiet hang for a full 30 seconds. Not as punishment, but as space, for the truth to settle, for denial to crack, for someone, anyone, to finally choose me over the illusion of peace. Then I reached into my bag again and pulled out a single sheet of paper, crisp and official-looking, printed on cream-colored bond. At the top, embossed in elegant script, statement of witness and intent, notarized affidavit of Eleanor Margaret Whitmore. Grandma's full name, her signature bold and unshaken beneath the notary seal, and below it in her own words. "I, Eleanor Whitmore, aged 82, of sound mind and legal capacity, hereby affirm under penalty of perjury that on November 27, 2025, during the Thanksgiving gathering at the residence of Linda Carter, I personally witnessed Mark Reynolds forcibly seize the arm of my granddaughter, redacted, causing visible distress. I further attest that I heard Mr. Reynolds state, 'You ruin one more holiday, and I'll make sure you disappear,' in a tone of explicit threat. I have observed a pattern of coercive control by Mr. Reynolds over the past 6 years, often dismissed as family tension. I stand in full support of my granddaughter's pursuit of legal and personal safety. This is not gossip. This is testimony." I didn't read it dramatically. I read it plainly, clearly, each word falling like a stone into still water. When I finished, I placed the original on the table and slid a copy toward Mom. She didn't take it at first. Her eyes darted to Mark, then to me, then to the floor, like she was searching for an exit that didn't exist in this room, in this moment. But Grandma, who had been sitting silently in the back row in her Sunday coat, stood slowly, leaning on her cherrywood cane, and walked to the front. She didn't speak to the room. She spoke only to her daughter. "Linda," she said, voice quiet but carrying the weight of 60 years of motherhood, "you have a choice. Right now, in front of all of us. You can keep pretending this is normal, or you can finally see your child." Mom's breath hitched. A tear slipped down her cheek. I turned to Mark then, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I've filed a petition to invalidate your claim to the property," I said. "I've submitted your financial transfers to Adult Protective Services as elder exploitation, and I've requested a permanent civil protection order against you for credible threats of harm." I paused. "This isn't about revenge. It's about record. And from this moment on, if you contact me, my home, or my grandmother, it will be a violation of court order, and I will press charges." Then I handed Mom one final document, a printed copy of the sheriff's incident report from the wellness check, stamped and signed. At the bottom, in bold, Credible concern for ongoing domestic intimidation. Subject advised of legal options. You choose, I said gently, meeting her eyes for the first time since Thanksgiving. Him or your daughter. The room didn't erupt. No shouting, no tears, no grand collapse. Just a terrible, beautiful stillness, as if the family had been holding its breath for 20 years and someone had finally given it permission to exhale. And in that silence, the accountability wasn't loud. It was absolute. Sealed in ink, verified by voice, witnessed by blood. Not a performance, not a plea, but a boundary drawn in daylight with receipts and grace enough to let her decide, finally, whose side she was on. 6 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning that smelled of wet pavement and distant snow, I sat in the county civil courthouse in a chair so hard it felt like penance. The courtroom was small, barely larger than Grandma's sunroom, with scuffed linoleum floors, a flag drooping slightly in the corner, and fluorescent lights that hummed like anxious bees. I wore my best blazer, the one with the subtle herringbone weave, and kept my hands folded in my lap so no one would see them tremble. Beside me sat my legal advocate, calm and crisp in a charcoal suit, her briefcase resting like a shield between us and the empty chairs where my family should have been. None of them came. Not Mom, not Mark, not even my uncle who'd texted a week prior. Hope you get what you need. Vague, distant, but not hostile. That counted for something. The judge, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too many families tear themselves apart over deeds and dinners, called our case just after 10 a.m. She'd already reviewed the filings. My affidavit, Grandma's notarized statement, the bank logs, the property records, the audio clip, submitted as a verified digital transcript with chain of custody documentation, and Mom's sworn declaration that she never knowingly transferred ownership of the home. Mark had filed a response, of course, 3 pages of deflection, calling the evidence emotional fabrication and me an opportunistic estranger. But he'd offered no counter-documents, no witnesses, no proof of his own, just bluster on paper. The judge didn't need to hear from him. She didn't even need to hear from me. She simply looked up from her bench, removed her glasses, and said, based on the preponderance of credible, corroborated evidence submitted by the petitioner, including witness testimony, financial trails, and audio verification, the court finds that the 2021 deed amendment adding Mark Reynolds to the title was procured under conditions of undue influence and lack of informed consent. Therefore, the amendment is hereby declared void ab initio. The original 2008 deed, held solely in the name of Linda E. Carter pursuant to her late husband's estate, is reinstated as legally binding. She paused, then added, furthermore, the court orders full restitution of the misappropriated funds totaling $24,350 to be repaid within 90 days, along with reimbursement of the petitioner's legal filing fees. The temporary protection order is made permanent. Contact of any kind, direct or indirect, is prohibited. Just like that, no gavel, no dramatic pronouncement, just facts, law, and the quiet click of justice clicking into place. I didn't cry, not then, but my chest unclenched in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child, before the whispers, before the bruises, before family first became a cage. I was no longer the girl who flinched at raised voices or apologized for taking up space. I was the plaintiff who'd documented, verified, and persisted. The granddaughter who'd trusted an elder's notebook like a compass. The daughter who'd given her mother one last chance to choose her, and built a life ready to stand alone if she didn't. As we stepped out of the courthouse into the drizzle, my advocate squeezed my shoulder. You did it, she said. Legally clean, morally clear. I looked up at the overcast sky, rain misting my face like a blessing. From disowned daughter to court-confirmed heir, not through rage but through receipts. Not through silence but through truth, spoken plainly and backed by proof. The house was mine to protect. My mother's future was hers to reclaim. And Mark, he could keep his stories. The law had already written the ending. The fallout didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came in quiet unravelings, the kind that happen when a house of cards finally meets a breeze. Within a week of the court ruling, Mark listed his leased downtown condo, a sleek, impersonal unit he'd bragged about as his escape from suburbia. and vanished from our town without so much as a forwarding address. No dramatic exit, no final confrontation, just a U-Haul spotted by a neighbor at dawn and a disconnected phone number by noon. His reputation, once polished with charming anecdotes and handshakes at PTA meetings, turned brittle in the whisper networks of our community. People didn't call him a monster, they didn't need to. They just stopped mentioning his name. Invitations dried up. His favorite coffee shop forgot his usual order. The local Rotary quietly removed him from their roster. It wasn't exile. It was erasure, the natural consequence of being exposed not by rumor, but by a court-stamped record. Mom didn't speak to him again. Not a text, not a call. She told me later, voice thin but resolute, that when she finally confronted him about the deed and the money, he'd shrugged and said, "You signed the papers. Don't act like you didn't know." That was the moment she realized he'd never seen her as a partner, only as a means to an asset, a grieving widow whose vulnerability he'd monetized like a commodity. She moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment near the community college, furnished with thrift store finds and a single framed photo of my father on the nightstand. She started therapy through the elder counseling program Grandma had recommended. Sometimes, when we met for tea, she'd stare into her cup and say, "I thought love meant enduring, but it doesn't. It means protecting." There was no jail time. This wasn't criminal court, and the system rarely treats financial coercion or emotional abuse with the gravity it deserves. But the civil judgment followed him like a shadow. The $24.350 restitution, plus fees, showed up on public court dockets. Any landlord, employer, or lender who ran a background check would see it. Reynolds, Mark A. civil judgment, fraudulent conveyance, elder financial exploitation. He couldn't refinance, couldn't secure a new lease under his own name, couldn't rebuild the facade without someone asking questions. And that, perhaps more than anything, was the consequence that cut deepest, the loss of control over his own narrative. My cousin reached out months later awkwardly over text. "I didn't get it then, I do now. Sorry it took me so long." My uncle sent a holiday card, just a snow scene, no note, but the return address was his. Small threads, frayed but not broken. I didn't rush to mend them, but I left the door open, just a crack. No one was ruined, no one was destroyed, but everyone was changed. And in the quiet aftermath, something unexpected bloomed. Clarity. Because real accountability isn't about punishment, it's about truth settling into the bones of a family and forcing it to grow new shapes. And sometimes, the most powerful consequence isn't a sentence, it's the silence that follows a lie when no one believes it anymore. 3 months after the court ruling, on a brittle February afternoon when the sky hung low and the sidewalks glittered with ice, I met Mom at a quiet diner on the edge of town, the kind with vinyl booths, bottomless coffee, and waitresses who call you honey without irony. She arrived 10 minutes early, bundled in a new coat I hadn't seen before, her hair shorter, her posture less defensive. We didn't hug, not yet. But she slid into the booth across from me and placed her hands flat on the Formica table, like she was showing me they were empty. No excuses, no justifications, just presence. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said before the coffee even arrived, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years. "But I need you to know I see it now, all of it." I nodded. I believed her, but belief wasn't enough to rebuild trust, not after decades of choosing silence over safety. So I took a breath and said what I'd rehearsed, not with anger, but with the careful precision of someone laying down floorboards. "I want to have a relationship with you, Mom, but it has to be different. It has to be safe." Then I laid out my terms, not as ultimatums, but as boundaries carved from hard-won clarity. No contact with Mark, ever, not even a "how are you" text. If he reached out, she was to forward it to me and my attorney immediately. Weekly therapy, not just for her, but family sessions we'd attend together when I was ready. And no shared holidays, no family gatherings, no just one dinner to smooth things over. Until we'd both done the work to ensure I'd never again be asked to smile through a threat for the sake of someone else's comfort. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't cry. She just exhaled long and slow, like she'd been holding her breath since Thanksgiving. "Okay," she said. "Okay, whatever it takes." I reached into my bag and slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check, not for me, but addressed to the counseling center, prepaying for 6 months of her individual sessions. "This isn't charity," I said gently. "It's investment in us." She touched the envelope like it was sacred. "You're giving me a chance," she whispered. "No," I said. "I'm giving us a structure. Grace isn't the absence of boundaries, Mom. It's the presence of them with love inside." Later, as we walked to our cars under a thin winter sun, she paused and looked at me, not as the daughter who ruined Thanksgiving, but as the woman who'd fought to save what was left of us. "I'm so proud of you," she said, and for the first time it didn't feel like a platitude. It felt like recognition. I didn't say, "I forgive you." Not yet. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a transaction. It was a landscape I'd walk through in my own time. But I did say, "I'm glad you're here." And that, for now, was enough. Because grace without conditions is just another form of erasure. But grace with boundaries, that's how broken things grow back stronger, not the same, but true. This past Thanksgiving, I served gravy from the same porcelain boat, the one with the hand-painted ivy vines curling around its base, the one that had once been the silent witness to my unraveling. But this time, it sat not on my mother's dining table, but on Grandma's, centered beneath the soft glow of the same brass chandelier that had watched so many fractures go unspoken. The lace runner was gone, replaced by a simple linen cloth the color of unbleached cotton. The silver was polished, yes, but not for show, just because Grandma liked things clean. And around the table sat not the family I was born into, but the one I'd chosen. My legal advocate, now a close friend, Mrs. Ruiz, who'd flown in from Arizona just to hug me. My cousin, who'd come alone this time, sober and listening. And Grandma, regal in her favorite emerald cardigan, her eyes bright with a peace I hadn't seen since Grandpa passed. I poured the gravy slowly, deliberately, feeling the warmth seep through the porcelain and into my palms. No one flinched. No one watched me with suspicion or pity. There was laughter, real laughter, and stories that didn't need editing for comfort. When my cousin asked how I was doing, I didn't say, "Fine." I said, "Healing." And no one tried to fix it. They just nodded, passed the sweet potatoes, and let the word hang in the air like incense. After dinner, I walked out to the backyard. The old rose garden, once overgrown and forgotten, was now neatly tended, its dormant canes wrapped in burlap against the frost. I'd replanted it myself in the spring, kneeling in the soil with Grandma beside me, her hands too frail to dig but her voice guiding each placement. Asterisk, this one's peace. That one's double delight. Don't crowd them, they need room to breathe. Back inside, as I washed the dishes, I ran my thumb over the base of the gravy boat. There, etched faintly with a jeweler's tool I'd borrowed from a friend, was a small W for witness asterisk. Not as a scar, but as a signature. A reminder that truth, once spoken and substantiated, doesn't just survive, it becomes part of the vessel that carries you forward. The house I'd fought for now stood empty, listed as a short-term rental for artists and writers through a local nonprofit, a quiet haven for those rebuilding their own stories. The deed was in a trust now, with Grandma as co-trustee, ensuring no single person could ever again claim ownership of a family's legacy through manipulation or silence. Standing at the sink, steam rising from the soapy water, I realized the motif had come full circle. The gravy boat no longer symbolized performance or peril. It held abundance, real, shared, unguarded. It carried memory not as a weight, but as a root. And as I dried it gently and placed it back in the cabinet, I knew I wasn't just preserving an heirloom. I was redefining what it meant to belong. Not through blood alone, but through boundaries, truth, and the quiet courage to say, "This ends with me." Now, when I look back on that Thanksgiving, the one that broke me open so I could finally put myself back together, I don't see just pain. I see the first stitch in a new kind of fabric. The kind woven not from obligation, but from choice. Not from silence, but from documented truth. If you've ever been told to, let it go for the family. To forgive and forget while your bruises were still fresh, or that your safety was secondary to someone else's comfort. I need you to hear this. Real family doesn't ask you to disappear. Real love doesn't require you to bleed quietly so others can feast in peace. What saved me wasn't a grand speech or a viral moment. It was a notebook filled with dates, a notarized statement from a neighbor who paid attention, a sheriff who took a wellness check seriously, a bank manager who saw fraud and didn't look away, and an 82-year-old woman who finally stood up from the table and said, "No, you don't need an army. You just need one ally who believes you and the courage to gather receipts, not just for them, but for yourself. Proof that what happened was real. That you matter, that your truth is worthy of protection." In the description below, I've linked a free safety planning toolkit I helped compile with domestic violence legal advocates. A living document with templates for documenting incidents, red flags of financial exploitation, scripts for talking to law enforcement, and a directory of elder law and civil legal aid services by state. Everything is confidential, printable, and designed for people who have been told they're overreacting. You're not. You're responding. And if this story helped you feel less alone, if it gave you even a sliver of clarity or the faintest whisper of asterisk, maybe, I don't have to stay quiet asterisk. Be honored if you subscribed. Not for drama, but for dignity. Because next week, I'm sharing how a retired librarian in a small town became my unexpected guardian angel, spotting forged signatures in probate records and quietly slipping me evidence that changed everything. Sometimes, your ally wears pearls and cardigans and knows exactly where the microfiche drawer is. You are not invisible, you are not too late, and your truth, it's already enough. You just need to protect it quietly, firmly, and with receipts.